Today on Problem Solved, we're speaking with the recipient of IISE's highest honor, the Frank and Lillian Gilbreth Award. Over the course of his career, Dr. Carter has helped pioneer healthcare systems engineering in Canada and mentored hundreds of students along the way. In this conversation, we talk about how he found his way into industrial engineering, why healthcare became his life's work, the future of AI in healthcare systems, and what receiving the Gilbreth Award means to him personally. Here's our conversation with Dr. Michael Carter. Today, we are joined by Dr. Michael Carter, a professor in mechanical and industrial engineering at the University of Toronto, where he has been since 1981. Over the course of his career, he has become a leading voice in healthcare systems engineering, with decades of work focused on healthcare resource modeling and improving how care is delivered. He is the founding director of the Center for Healthcare Engineering and has mentored hundreds of students, many of whom are now working directly in healthcare systems today. His impact spans research, education, and real-world implementation, contributing to healthcare in Canada and beyond. Dr. Carter is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, Informs, and IISE. And most recently, he has been named the recipient of the Frank and Lillian Gilbreth Award, IISE's highest honor. So, Dr. Carter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, let's start at the beginning of your journey, if you don't mind taking us back a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about how did you first find your way into industrial engineering and ultimately into a career as a professor?
Well, that's right. No, it's interesting that when I started out now in 1960s, I decided I wanted to be a computer programmer. I wanted to learn about programming. And so I enrolled in computer science at the University of Waterloo. Waterloo at that time was the only university in Canada where undergraduates were allowed access to computers. And so I went there. And around in my third year, I took a course in operations research. And it sort of changed the direction of my life. I really enjoyed it. I really liked it. And I decided I wanted to specialize in operations research. I switched specialties from computer science to combinatorics and optimization, sort of very theoretical operations research. And I wound up, when I graduated, I actually got a job at the University of Waterloo as a systems analyst. I worked there for 7 years, and I decided I wanted to do graduate work just to find out more about operations research. So I did a master's and part-time, and then I started a PhD just to pick up more courses. I really had no idea about being a professor or going on. And my joke was, during my PhD, they wanted me to do theory. They wanted me to solve theoretical problems. I wanted to solve real problems. And I should have been in industrial engineering all the time, but frankly, because of the name, I didn't know that they were really the application of operations research. In 1981, I got hired as assistant professor in industrial engineering at the University of Toronto, and I ended up where I should have been.
So it kind of took you a while to find your way there, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I know I meet undergraduate students today who have decided, I'm going to do a PhD and be a professor. That was not me.
Yeah. So at some point along the way, though, your work began to kind of focus on healthcare. So can you kind of tell us when that transition happened? Was there something like in particular that made you realize you could really make an impact in that field?
Exactly. I spent sort of the first 10 years of my academic career working on scheduling problems with companies, looking at process optimization, operations research applications. And then in around 1985, I got hired to do a small consulting project with one of the hospitals in Toronto. And the problem they had was that nurses in Ontario at that time, the standard workday was 8.5 hours. And the reason it was 8.5 hours is there was a half an hour for turnover, for handoff. The nurse from the previous shift could talk to the nurse coming on, and they spent a half an hour talking about patients. And in 1985, the nursing union in Ontario, they changed they got an agreement to do 8-hour work. And now it has created handoff problems that continue today, but that's another story. Anyway, one of the hospitals came to me, and they had operating room nurses, 53 operating room nurses, and they said, well, we're going from 8.5 to 8 hours. The nurses were basically working from Monday to Friday, from 7:30 to 4 o'clock, and they're going for 8. They're losing a half an hour per nurse, so they figured they probably need to hire 3 more nurses to fill the gap. So they asked me to look at the problem, and they gave me 2 months' worth of schedules. And what I quickly realized was that the nurses were showing up at 7:30 in the morning, spend a half an hour prepping the room. The room was ready to go at 8 o'clock. The doctors were showing up at 9 and 10. And then the doctors were sometimes working overtime and going till 6 or 7 at night. The nurses were working overtime. And not only that, but on Friday afternoon, nothing was happening. They had virtually no operations on Friday afternoons. So the nurses were sitting around with nothing to do. So I looked at it and I said, well, really what you need to do is you really need to do, this doesn't make any sense. So what we should have is we should have staggered start times for the nurses and probably longer days, Monday to Thursday, shorter days on Friday. And so I made this report and I said, you don't need new nurses, you can just redistribute the work you've got. Makes perfect sense. And I gave it to them and they were furious because what they wanted was Professor Carter to write a report to say they needed to hire 3 nurses to go to the board. And that's not what I said. And I realized the inefficiency of it all, it was crazy. Now the doctors in Ontario typically do not work for the hospital. The doctors are private, the doctors work on their own, and they are paid fee for service, so they get paid for what they do. So they really didn't care. Anyway, so and then 4 years later, I got involved in a large project, major project, looking at operating room scheduling, and a simulation project with 5 large hospitals in Toronto. And I realized that the hospitals were incredibly inefficient, not just with the doctor's time, but all over the place. There were no standards, there was no data collection, there were no performance metrics or error tracking. Each physician was running their own show at their convenience. No one was allowed to question the doctor. There were no appointments on Friday afternoon. Surgery started late, finished early, finished late. They didn't care. There was no concept of patient flow, of process flow. Every part of healthcare was working in silos. I mean, if you ran a company like this, it would fold in weeks. And I looked at it, from an industrial engineering perspective, it was a disaster. I mean, things are quite a bit better now. We've still got a lot of issues, but things have changed. And nobody was doing anything. And in Canada, very little in the U.S., and I felt something had to be done.
Yeah.
And I decided the only way that Mike Carter, I could influence, assistant professor, that I could influence the industry, I had to create a small army of IEs working in healthcare. And so I've spent the past 38 years trying to convince engineers to work in healthcare. And I also had to convince healthcare they needed engineers. So this became my passion. I wanted to make a difference. And this isn't a research project. This has been a full-time passion. I'm pushing 80 years of age and I'm still working full-time. It still needs me. And one of the things that I realized was that there were many people within the industry who knew that things were bad. And they knew that change was necessary. But they didn't know how to do it. So my approach was to sort of dig out these individuals and then match them up with student projects to demonstrate the obvious advantages of an engineering approach to a wider audience and demonstrate the value in process improvement methods. And so over the years, my network, I've just been networking. That's been my basic method, has been trying to network with people within healthcare.
Well, when you look back over the past of your career and the way that the field has evolved, and then when you look at the future, like we can't talk about the future without at least talking about AI a little bit and things like advanced technology. So how do you see AI and advanced technology? How do you see that changing the way that healthcare modeling is going to be taught and practiced in the future?
Well, it's funny, that I'm a dinosaur. All of my students all want to do AI. Mm-hmm. And I actually took a 2-week boot camp, intro to AI, a couple of years ago. So at least I would know what they were talking about.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That's not bad, right? And everybody in healthcare, they all want to do AI applications. And one of the major problems with that is that AI typically requires large, comprehensive data sets. I want to be able to predict what's going to happen to these patients, and so I need a data set with a few million patients and all their information. Mm-hmm. And typically in healthcare we don't do it. People don't share data. So primary care docs have electronic data, but they don't share with the hospitals. The hospitals don't share long-term care, rehab, walk-in clinics. I think we're moving to a point where researchers are beginning to get access to large, comprehensive, de-identified data set. It's a work in progress, and I think it's a huge opportunity. I have students doing work on natural language processing to extract labeled data from doctors' notes. Doctors are recording their notes now in machine-readable form, so we pull information out of it. I have students developing models to predict adverse events before they happen. For example, for patients who are on chemotherapy, they often wind up in the emergency department. And if we could predict who might be doing that, we could maybe change their protocol a little bit. I tell high school students about industrial engineering and in particular information systems. And I tell them that, like computer science develops tools and computer engineers develop the machines. And industrial engineers help users apply these tools to make their work easier, faster, more effective. You'd never send a computer scientist to help a user. They would come up with something inappropriate. And I think the same is true for AI, that Indies really need to know about the tools and how to design systems to make it easier for users to do their jobs. And I think that's our role, and it's that interface with the user.
What's your big hope for the field of industrial systems engineering in the future?
Well, I think it's in a sense it hasn't changed, right? So back to the Gilbreths, what they were trying to do was make it easier for people to do things and make it make people more efficient, more effective. Industrial engineering, in my own area in healthcare, we really didn't have industrial engineers 35 years ago looking at processes within healthcare, and today they really are. Today we now have in every hospital that I know about has performance measurement and improvement teams reporting. They are tracking and measuring safety and quality metrics, optimization of operational processes.
So at this stage in your career, what does receiving this award, the Frank and Lillian Gilbreth Award, what does it mean to you?
Oh, it's huge. It's it is truly special. It was unexpected. I think the Gilbreths were pioneers in the application of industrial engineering concepts, and it's a privilege and an honor to be counted among people like them. I don't think of myself as a pioneer like them, but it was sure an uphill battle for years. I've had several awards from Canadian engineering and healthcare organizations, but getting this from IISE is international, and I look around at colleagues in other areas and going like, why me? And like I said, I was really surprised and honored.
Well, you've influenced many people throughout your career, many students, and so your impact, it's directly on your students, but then it's also through what your students have gone on to do. So if you take a moment to stop and reflect on that kind of ripple effect that you've had, I mean, how does that make you feel when you stop to think about that for a minute?
I mean, that's a lot of the things that I have accomplished, I didn't really do. I mean, what I did was I encouraged students to get out into healthcare. And, I've been doing this for so long now, many of them have worked their way up the food chain, and they are making a difference, and they are changing things. And so I've created a path for them to go out and do wonderful things. So to me, this is amazing. I just sit back and watch them and go, wow.
Dr. Carter, congratulations on your very well-deserved honor receiving the Frank and Lillian Gilbreth Award, and thank you very, very much for talking with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's a pleasure.
Dr. Michael Carter, recipient of the 2026 Frank and Lillian Gilbreth Award, and hearing Dr. Carter reflect on the Gilbreths themselves raised another question for us. Who exactly were Frank and Lillian Gilbreth beyond the names attached to the awards, scholarships, and engineering history? Next time on Problem Solved, we take a deeper look at the real people behind the legacy with Mike Farrelly of the Montclair History Center.
He gave Frank a job as a helper, and he started paying attention to how each individual bricklayer did their job and noticed that they didn't all do it the same way. And he began to start thinking about the best way. Nothing deterred Lillian. She was interested in the psychology of how things worked. That, by the way, is one of the biggest differences between them and Frederick Taylor, is Frank and Lillian were very interested in the individual. And in many ways, even though she was the quiet partner, she was the dynamo behind Frank and Lillian's collaboration. People would see this enormous family coming at them and ask Frank, well, what's it like to have all these kids? And, they're cheaper by the dozen. So
we hope you'll join us next time for a historic deep dive on Problem Solved.